Coronation of King Charles III. King Charles III Coronation Rehearsal 2023, 305-2023, King Charles. There was no grand ceremony yet, no cheering crowds lining the streets, but something important was happening quietly behind palace walls. It was a moment many people had waited decades to see, even if they did not fully realize it yet. King Charles III, now the monarch of the United Kingdom, was preparing for the most significant day of his life. This was not the coronation itself, but the rehearsal for it. Even so, the weight of history was already present in every step he took. King Charles had spent most of his life preparing for this role. From a young age, he knew his path was decided for him. As the eldest son of Queen Elizabeth II, he grew up with duty woven into every part of his life. While other children dreamed of different futures, his future was already written. He would one day be king, but that day seemed very far away. His mother reigned for more than 70 years, becoming a symbol of stability and dedication across the world. During those long years, Charles learned patience, responsibility, and the importance of service. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away, the nation entered a period of deep reflection. People remembered her long life, her steady presence, and her sense of duty. At the same time, they looked toward the future. Charles became king immediately after her passing, but a coronation is not rushed. It is a sacred and historic ceremony that requires careful planning. For months, teams worked quietly to prepare every detail. The rehearsal on May 3 was one of the final steps before the world would witness the official crowning. That morning, King Charles arrived at Westminster Abbey with a calm but serious expression. The abbey was not filled with thousands of guests yet. Instead, it was occupied by clergy, officials, guards, musicians, and organizers. The building itself seemed to breathe history. Kings and queens had been crowned there for centuries, and its stone walls had witnessed moments of triumph, sorrow, and change. Walking through the abbey, Charles was stepping into the same space once occupied by his ancestors. As the rehearsal began, every movement was practiced with great care. The coronation ceremony is filled with traditions that go back hundreds of years. Each step, each pause, and each spoken word has meaning. King Charles listened closely to instructions, sometimes stopping to ask questions or repeat a movement. This was not about perfection for appearance alone. It was about honoring tradition and understanding the responsibility he was about to accept. Observers noticed how focused he was. There was no sign of pride or excitement in the usual sense. Instead, there was seriousness and thoughtfulness. He understood that the crown was not just a symbol of authority. It represented service to the people, respect for history, and a promise to lead with care. During the rehearsal, he practiced moments where he would stand alone, moments where he would kneel, and moments where he would be surrounded by others offering support. Each position reflected a different part of kingship. The atmosphere inside the abbey was quiet and respectful. Guards stood still, clergy reviewed their roles, and musicians softly practiced their pieces. Everyone knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. For many of those present, this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Some had served in previous royal events, but a coronation always carries a special weight. It marks the beginning of a new chapter for the nation. King Charles took moments to look around the abbey during breaks in the rehearsal. It is said that he reflected on his mother during these moments. Queen Elizabeth II had stood in the same place decades earlier, young and determined, taking on a role that would define her life. Now he was following in her footsteps, but under very different circumstances. The world had changed, and so had the monarchy. Expectations were different, and challenges were more complex. This rehearsal was not only about tradition. It was also about preparing for a modern audience. Millions of people around the world would watch the coronation. Cameras, technology, and global media meant that every detail would be seen and discussed. The rehearsal allowed organizers to ensure that everything would flow smoothly. For King Charles, it was a chance to grow comfortable with the structure of the ceremony so that, on the actual day, he could focus on its meaning rather than its mechanics. Throughout the rehearsal, there were moments of silence that felt powerful. In those pauses, the reality of the situation seemed to settle in. Charles was no longer just preparing for a future role. He was already king, and the coronation would publicly affirm that truth. The rehearsal made this reality more personal. Standing in the abbey, wearing practice robes, and hearing ancient words spoken aloud brought the moment closer than ever. People close to the process noticed that Charles carried himself with humility. He did not act as someone seeking attention. Instead, he behaved like someone accepting a heavy responsibility. Years of waiting had shaped him. He had seen both public support and criticism throughout his life. Those experiences had taught him resilience and understanding. Now, as king, he would need those qualities more than ever. Outside the abbey, life in London continued as usual. Many people were unaware of what was happening inside at that exact moment. Yet, in a quiet way, history was being shaped. The rehearsal was a reminder that major moments are often built through unseen preparation. The smoothness of a public ceremony depends on countless hours of practice behind the scenes. As the rehearsal progressed, officials adjusted small details. Positions were marked, timings were reviewed, and movements were refined. King Charles repeated certain actions several times to ensure they felt natural. Each repetition strengthened his confidence. By the end of the rehearsal, there was a shared sense of readiness among those present. They knew that while challenges could still arise, the foundation was strong. When the rehearsal finally came to an end, King Charles took a moment before leaving the abbey. It was not a dramatic pause, but a quiet one. He seemed aware that the next time he stood there, the eyes of the world would be upon him. This rehearsal was the last opportunity to experience the ceremony in private, away from cameras and crowds. As he walked away, the significance of the moment lingered in the air. The coronation was no longer a distant event on a calendar. It was close, real, and unavoidable. The rehearsal on May 3, 2023, marked the point where preparation met destiny. A man who had waited a lifetime was now just days away from being crowned before the world. This was only the beginning. The rehearsal had set the stage, but the true test was yet to come. The nation stood quietly on the edge of a historic moment, unaware that behind closed doors, a king had already taken his first ceremonial steps toward the crown. The next phase of preparation began soon after the first rehearsal ended. While the public still saw only headlines and short news updates, the work behind the scenes became even more detailed. For King Charles III, the days leading up to the coronation were filled with careful planning, quiet reflection, and repeated practice. The rehearsal on May 3, 2023, was not a single event, but part of a larger process designed to make sure every moment of the ceremony would be carried out with dignity and purpose. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere remained focused and calm. Every person involved understood the importance of their role. From senior clergy to young choir members, each individual had a responsibility that contributed to the whole. King Charles arrived early once again, dressed in simple practice clothing, ready to go through the sequence step by step. There was no sense of rush. Instead, everything moved at a steady and thoughtful pace. The organizers guided the king through the full flow of the ceremony. He practiced entering the abbey, walking the long aisle, and taking his place at key points. These movements may have looked simple, but they required careful timing. Music, spoken words, and movement all had to align perfectly. During the rehearsal, pauses were added, removed, and adjusted until everything felt balanced. King Charles listened carefully and followed each instruction with patience. At several points, the rehearsal paused so adjustments could be discussed. Sometimes it was about where someone should stand. Other times it was about the order of events. King Charles took part in these discussions quietly, offering his thoughts when needed. His approach was respectful and cooperative. He did not act as someone giving commands, but as someone working alongside others to achieve the best result. One of the most meaningful parts of the rehearsal involved the symbolic moments of the ceremony. These moments were not about display, but about commitment and service. King Charles practiced these sections slowly, ensuring he understood their meaning. Observers noticed that he often paused before continuing, as if allowing the importance of the moment to settle in. This showed that he was not treating the rehearsal as a routine task, but as preparation for a promise he would soon make to the nation. As the rehearsal continued, the abbey filled with sound. The choir practiced their voices, filling the ancient space with music that echoed off the stone walls. Musicians tested instruments, and the sound carried through the building. King Charles stood quietly during these moments, listening. Music has always been an important part of royal ceremonies, and this rehearsal helped ensure that every note would support the emotion of the occasion. Security and coordination were also reviewed carefully. Guards practiced their positions, movements, and timing. Everything had to be precise but calm. The goal was not to create tension, but to maintain order and respect. King Charles moved among them smoothly, following the planned paths and stopping at designated points. Each repetition helped reduce uncertainty and build confidence for the final day. Throughout the rehearsal, there was a sense of shared responsibility. Everyone present understood that the coronation was not about one person alone. It was about the nation, its history, and its future. King Charles seemed fully aware of this. His behavior reflected a deep understanding that the crown represented service rather than personal achievement. During short breaks, King Charles spoke quietly with senior officials and clergy. These conversations were practical, focused on details and timing. At the same time, there were moments of personal reflection. Those close to him noticed that he appeared thoughtful, sometimes distant, as if considering the long journey that had led him to this point. Years of waiting, learning, and preparing had brought him here, standing in the place where he would soon be formally crowned. The rehearsal also allowed space to consider how the ceremony would be seen by people around the world. Modern technology meant that every movement would be recorded and shared instantly. This added a new layer of responsibility. King Charles understood that his actions would be closely watched and interpreted. The rehearsal helped ensure that his focus would remain on the meaning of the ceremony, rather than the presence of cameras. As the day went on, fatigue naturally set in, but the mood remained steady. No one complained or rushed. The seriousness of the task kept everyone attentive. King Charles continued to repeat certain parts of the ceremony until they felt natural. This repetition was not about memorization alone. It was about creating a sense of calm and readiness that would carry into the actual coronation. One particularly quiet moment occurred near the end of the rehearsal. The abbey was almost still, with only soft sounds echoing in the background. King Charles stood alone in his position, practicing a moment that would later be watched by millions. In that silence, the weight of responsibility was clear. This was not a performance. It was a commitment that would shape the rest of his life. As the rehearsal drew to a close, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The main structure of the ceremony had been completed successfully. Small notes were taken for final adjustments, but overall, there was a sense of confidence. King Charles thanked those involved with simple words and gestures. His appreciation was quiet but sincere. Leaving the abbey that day, King Charles carried more than just a schedule in his mind. He carried the understanding that the rehearsal had brought everything closer to reality. The ceremony was no longer an idea or a plan. It was something he had physically walked through, step by step. This experience helped transform anticipation into acceptance. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm. People went to work, buses moved through the streets, and life went on as usual. Few knew that inside the abbey, the foundation for a historic moment had been carefully reinforced. The rehearsal had done its job. It prepared the ceremony, but it also prepared the king. As May 3, 2023 came to an end, King Charles returned to his private space with much to think about. The rehearsal had shown him not only what the coronation would look like, but what it would demand of him. The crown was closer now than ever before. With each practice step, he moved further away from preparation and closer to responsibility. This second stage of rehearsal confirmed something important. King Charles was not simply inheriting a title. He was stepping into a role shaped by centuries of tradition and modern expectation. The rehearsal had strengthened his resolve and sharpened his focus. Ahead lay the final days before the coronation, and beyond that, a lifetime of service. As the days moved closer to the coronation, the focus of preparation began to change. The earlier rehearsals had been about learning movements and timing, but now the attention turned to meaning. For King Charles III, this stage was deeply personal. He was not only stepping into an ancient role, but also shaping how that role would be understood in the modern world. The rehearsal process became a space where tradition and present-day values quietly met. Inside Westminster Abbey, the atmosphere felt different from the first rehearsals. The structure was already familiar. King Charles knew where to walk, when to stop, and how to move through the ceremony. Because of this, his mind was freer to reflect on what each moment truly represented. Every symbol, every spoken word, and every gesture carried a history that stretched back centuries. At the same time, the world outside the abbey was very different from the world of past coronations. King Charles had spent much of his life thinking about service, responsibility, and unity. These ideas were important to him long before he became king. During this phase of rehearsal, those beliefs quietly shaped the ceremony. While the core traditions remained unchanged, small choices reflected a desire to connect with people from all walks of life. The aim was not to remove history, but to allow it to speak to the present. During practice, King Charles often listened more than he spoke. When clergy explained the meaning behind certain parts of the ceremony, he paid close attention. These explanations were not new to him, but hearing them spoken aloud in the place where they would soon be performed made them feel more real. He treated each part with respect, understanding that millions would see these moments as a reflection of his character as a leader. One important focus was balance. The monarchy stands on tradition, but it also exists in a changing society. King Charles understood that many people looked to the coronation not just as a royal event, but as a sign of how the monarchy would move forward. During rehearsal, decisions were made carefully to ensure the ceremony felt respectful, welcoming, and meaningful without losing its historic foundation. Music played a strong role during this stage of preparation. The abbey filled with rehearsed voices and instruments, creating an atmosphere that felt both ancient and alive. King Charles stood quietly as the music flowed around him. For him, these sounds were not just background elements. They helped express emotions that words alone could not. The music added depth to the ceremony and supported the sense of shared experience. There were moments during rehearsal when King Charles appeared lost in thought. Those observing him noticed that he sometimes looked upward, taking in the height and space of the abbey. It was easy to imagine him thinking about the kings and queens who had stood there before him. Each had faced their own challenges, their own hopes, and their own doubts. Now it was his turn to carry that legacy forward. This stage of rehearsal also included discussions about public understanding. The coronation would be watched by people who knew little about royal traditions. For them, the ceremony needed to be clear in purpose and tone. King Charles supported efforts to ensure that the message of service and unity would come through strongly. The goal was not to impress, but to connect. As practice continued, the king became more comfortable with the flow of the ceremony. Movements that once required concentration now felt natural. This allowed him to focus on presence rather than performance. He stood straighter, moved with calm confidence, and carried himself with quiet assurance. There was no sense of show. Instead, there was steadiness. At one point during the rehearsal, a short pause was taken to adjust timing. During that break, King Charles spoke softly with a member of the clergy. Their conversation was brief, but it reflected the seriousness of the moment. They discussed the importance of humility and dedication. These were not just words for a ceremony. They were principles meant to guide a lifetime of leadership. This part of the preparation highlighted how deeply King Charles viewed his role. He did not see the crown as a reward or achievement. He saw it as a responsibility passed down through generations. The rehearsal helped reinforce that understanding. Standing in the abbey, surrounded by symbols of history, made the reality clear. Once crowned, his actions would carry weight far beyond personal preference. Outside the abbey, public interest continued to grow. News reports spoke of the upcoming coronation, and people discussed what it would mean for the country. Inside, however, the focus remained calm and steady. There was no excitement in the usual sense. Instead, there was a quiet determination to do things properly and respectfully. As the rehearsal moved toward its later stages, there was a noticeable sense of alignment among everyone involved. Clergy, guards, musicians, and organizers worked smoothly together. King Charles fit naturally into this structure, not above it, but within it. This reflected his belief that leadership is strongest when it works alongside others. One of the final moments practiced during this stage carried special meaning. It was a moment that symbolized acceptance of duty. King Charles approached it with great care, moving slowly and deliberately. Observers could see that this was not just a formal action for him. It was a moment of personal commitment. Practicing it allowed him to prepare emotionally as well as physically. By the end of the day, there was a sense that something important had settled into place. The ceremony was no longer just a series of steps. It had become a story with purpose and meaning. King Charles had moved from learning the form of the coronation to understanding its heart. As he left the abbey, the quiet streets outside felt different. The world continued as normal, but for him, everything was changing. The rehearsal had helped him bridge the past and the future. It showed how tradition could remain strong while still speaking to the present. This stage of preparation confirmed that the coronation would not simply mark the beginning of a reign. It would express the values that King Charles wished to uphold. Service, respect, and responsibility were woven into every part of the ceremony. The rehearsal allowed these values to take shape clearly and calmly. With each passing day, the moment of coronation drew closer. The practice inside Westminster Abbey was shaping not only a historic event, but also the mindset of the man who would lead the nation forward. The crown was no longer just a symbol waiting to be placed. It was a responsibility already being carried, quietly and thoughtfully, long before the ceremony itself. As the coronation day came closer, the atmosphere around King Charles' III grew heavier with meaning. By this stage, the rehearsals were no longer about learning or adjusting. They were about facing the reality of what was about to happen. The crown was no longer an idea or a future plan. It was something that waited just ahead, carrying with it expectations, history, and responsibility. For King Charles, this period was one of deep thought and quiet strength. Inside Westminster Abbey, the rehearsals continued, but the tone had changed. Everyone involved could feel it. There was a sense of finality in the air, as if each step practiced now was sealing something permanent. King Charles moved through the ceremony with calm confidence, yet his expressions showed awareness of the moment's seriousness. He was not nervous, but thoughtful. Each action reminded him that his life had reached a turning point. During this stage, special attention was given to the most symbolic moments of the coronation. These were the moments that carried the greatest meaning and would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. King Charles practiced them carefully, not rushing, not cutting corners. He understood that these actions were not just for the audience or the cameras. They were promises made before history and the people. At times, the abbey felt almost silent. The usual sounds of movement and instruction paused, leaving only echoes and soft footsteps. In those quiet moments, King Charles stood alone in the vast space. Observers noticed how still he became, as if listening not just to the room, but to his own thoughts. The weight of leadership can be heavy, and this rehearsal brought that weight into clear focus. The presence of tradition was especially strong now. Every symbol in the abbey seemed to speak. The stone walls, the high ceilings, and the ancient layout all reminded him that many rulers had stood here before. Some had ruled wisely, others less so. All had carried the burden of leadership. King Charles knew he would soon join that long line, and that history would judge his actions just as it had judged theirs. This stage of rehearsal also included moments where King Charles practiced standing still, while others performed their roles around him. These moments symbolized something important. A king does not act alone. Leadership is supported by many hands and voices. Watching clergy, guards, and officials move into place around him reinforced the idea that his role was part of a larger structure. It was not about personal control, but about shared responsibility. As rehearsals went on, fatigue could be felt among everyone involved. Long hours and repeated practice naturally took their toll. Still, no one complained. The seriousness of the occasion kept everyone focused. King Charles showed quiet endurance during this time. His steady presence helped maintain calm, even when the schedule became demanding. During breaks, King Charles often chose quiet over conversation. He would sit or stand away from the main group, reflecting. Those who knew him well understood this was how he processed important moments. Years of preparation had taught him patience and thoughtfulness. This was not a man rushing toward attention. This was someone accepting a duty that could not be set aside. The memory of Queen Elizabeth II seemed especially close during this period. Though she was not physically present, her influence was deeply felt. King Charles had watched her carry the crown with dignity for decades. Now, as he rehearsed for his own coronation, he reflected on her example. Her sense of service, discipline, and calm leadership served as a quiet guide. One rehearsal moment focused on the act that would publicly confirm his role as king. Practicing, it brought a visible shift in his expression. This was the point where symbolism became reality. Repeating this moment allowed him to prepare emotionally. Each practice made the idea of permanent responsibility more real. Security and coordination were also reviewed carefully at this stage. The final version of the ceremony needed to be smooth and respectful. King Charles followed the guidance of officials closely. His willingness to listen and cooperate showed his understanding that leadership includes trust in others. This attitude strengthened the entire process. Outside the abbey, interest in the coronation continued to grow. People spoke about it in homes, workplaces, and public spaces. For many, it was a historic moment they never expected to witness. Inside the abbey, however, there was no celebration yet. There was only preparation, reflection, and careful attention to detail. As the rehearsal neared its end, a noticeable calm settled over the space. The main elements were complete. There were no major changes left to make. King Charles moved through the final practice with quiet assurance. The steps that once required instruction now flowed naturally. This showed that he was ready, not just in action but in mindset. One final pause stood out during this stage. King Charles stood in position, alone for a brief moment, as if marking the transition in his own mind. This pause was not planned, but it felt meaningful. It was the moment where preparation gave way to acceptance. The crown was no longer something approaching. It was something he was prepared to carry. As he left the abbey that day, the weight of the upcoming ceremony followed him. Yet there was also a sense of clarity. The rehearsals had done more than prepare an event. They had prepared a king. Through repetition, reflection, and respect for tradition, King Charles had faced the reality of his role with honesty and resolve. This stage of preparation revealed the true weight of the crown. It was not made heavy by jewels or ceremony, but by responsibility. King Charles understood that once crowned, his words and actions would matter more than ever. The rehearsal allowed him to step into that understanding fully, without illusion. The nation waited, unaware of these quiet moments of reflection. The world would soon see the grand ceremony, the music, and the historic images. But behind all of that stood a man who had faced the seriousness of leadership in silence. As the final days before the coronation approached, there was no turning back. The rehearsals had reached their purpose. King Charles stood ready, not because everything was perfect, but because he understood what was required of him. The weight of the crown had been felt, accepted, and carried in advance. The next time he would walk into Westminster Abbey, it would not be for practice. It would be for history. The final days arrived quietly, without drama or noise. After weeks of preparation and repeated rehearsals, everything that could be practiced had been practiced. Inside Westminster Abbey, the space felt ready, almost waiting. For King Charles III, this stage was no longer about learning or adjustment. It was about trust. Trust in the people around him, trust in the process, and trust in himself to carry out the role placed before him. On the last rehearsal day, there was a noticeable calm. The movements flowed smoothly, the timing felt natural, and there were no major pauses for correction. Everyone involved knew their place. The abbey, which had once felt overwhelming, now felt familiar. King Charles walked its paths with steady steps, not as someone visiting a historic place, but as someone who belonged there. There was a shared understanding among those present that this was the final private moment before the world would watch. The ceremony would soon move from quiet preparation to global attention. Cameras, crowds, and voices would fill the space. But for now, there was still silence, respect, and focus. This calm allowed King Charles to gather his thoughts and reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He had waited many years for this role, longer than any heir before him. That waiting had shaped him. It had taught him patience, humility, and persistence. During those years, he had carried out duties without wearing a crown, learning how to serve without holding ultimate authority. Now, as the coronation approached, those lessons felt more valuable than ever. In the abbey, King Charles took a moment to stand still, looking forward. This was not part of the rehearsal schedule. It was a personal pause. In that moment, the noise of the outside world seemed distant. There was no pressure to perform, no need to speak. It was simply a moment of acceptance. He was ready. The final walkthrough of the ceremony confirmed that everything was in place. Clergy moved confidently, guards stood firm, and musicians prepared quietly. The teamwork was strong. King Charles thanked those around him with simple words and gestures. There was no grand speech, only quiet appreciation. His manner reflected his belief that leadership is built through respect and cooperation. As the rehearsal ended, the abbey slowly emptied. One by one, people gathered their belongings and left the space. The echoes of footsteps faded, leaving the building quiet once again. King Charles was among the last to leave. As he walked toward the exit, he knew that the next time he entered, it would be under very different circumstances. Outside, the city was alive with anticipation. Streets were being prepared, decorations were visible, and conversations about the coronation could be heard everywhere. People of all ages spoke about the upcoming event, sharing curiosity, hope, and reflection. For many, this was a moment they never thought they would see. A new king being crowned marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The night before the coronation passed quietly for King Charles. There were no celebrations or distractions. Instead, it was a time for rest and reflection. He understood the importance of being present and focused. The responsibility ahead required clarity of mind and steadiness of heart. When the day of the coronation arrived, the world's attention turned toward Westminster Abbey. Crowds gathered, cameras rolled, and history unfolded in real time. Inside the abbey, the ceremony followed the structure that had been practiced so carefully. Each movement, each pause, and each word flowed as planned. King Charles moved with calm assurance. The rehearsals had prepared him well. Because the steps were familiar, his attention could remain on the meaning behind them. This allowed him to remain composed and thoughtful throughout the ceremony. His expressions reflected seriousness, respect, and a deep sense of duty. As the ceremony progressed, the symbolism became clear to all who watched. This was not about power or display. It was about service, responsibility, and continuity. King Charles accepted the role before the nation and the world, fully aware of what it represented. The promises made were not light or temporary. They were lifelong commitments. For those who had seen him during the rehearsals, the difference was clear. In private, he had prepared carefully and quietly. In public, he carried that preparation with confidence and dignity. The transition from rehearsal to reality was smooth because the foundation had been strong. When the ceremony reached its conclusion, there was a sense of shared relief and pride among those involved. The coronation had unfolded with respect and grace. The months of planning and practice had achieved their purpose. King Charles had been crowned, and a new chapter had officially begun. After the ceremony, as the abbey once again grew quiet, the significance of what had happened began to settle. The crown was no longer something to prepare for. It was now part of King Charles's daily reality. The responsibilities he had practiced for were now fully his. For the nation, the coronation marked a moment of reflection and hope. It honored the past while looking toward the future. People saw in King Charles a leader shaped by experience, patience, and understanding. His long journey to the throne had given him perspective that few others could have. Looking back, the rehearsal on May 3, 2023, stood out as a key moment in this journey. It was the place where preparation met purpose. Away from the crowds and cameras, a king had taken his first ceremonial steps toward a role that would define the rest of his life. The coronation itself was grand and historic, but it was built on quiet moments of focus and reflection. Those moments, unseen by most, were just as important. They ensured that when the crown was finally placed, it rested on someone who understood its weight. As King Charles moved forward into his reign, the lessons of those rehearsals remained with him. They reminded him that leadership begins long before public recognition. It begins in preparation, in humility, and in respect for the responsibility given. The story of the coronation was not just about a single day. It was about a lifetime of waiting, learning, and serving. From quiet rehearsals inside an ancient abbey to a ceremony watched by the world, the journey was complete. And yet, in many ways, it was only just beginning.